Hello and welcome to the session themed Arts and Climate. My name is Polly McPherson and I'm Associate Head of School for Enterprise, leading on the Knowledge Exchange, Enterprise and Creative Industries agenda within the School of Art, Design and Architecture here at the University of Plymouth. Additionally, I'm a Professor of Design and I work with a group of internationally acclaimed practitioners who teach the designing, creating and making of objects and artefacts. I have a background in making and a specialism in ceramics, and I'm particularly interested in how things are made, how things can be made ethically and sustainably, and how this can be taught in order to nurture individuals' own creative voices. This leads me on today's theme, arts and culture. I'm delighted to welcome our two speakers, Dr. Richard Povall and Dr. David Sargent. Dr. Povall is a curatorial producer, a cultural producer, researcher, educator, and founding director of art.org. His practice and research centres around the natural world, ecological systems, art, and practices. He has a number of creative companies. He's run a number of creative companies, held senior academic posts at universities in the UK and the USA, and is currently a visiting research professor at Professor of Science at National Institute of Science and Technology in South Korea. He has a doctorate from the University of Plymouth, sits on boards of a number of creative organisations, and is a member of the Cultural Leadership Group at the Eden Project. Our second speaker is Dr. Sargent, who is a Professor of 20th and 21st Century Literature at the University of Plymouth. His recent research has focused on contemporary fiction of the near future, examining the intersections between politics, history and the environment, and the uses of utopia thought. He is also a fiction writer and poet, and his work was included in the Keep It in the Ground series on climate change, commissioned by The Guardian and curated by the Poet Laureate. In this section, our speakers will both present before we then come back for questions. Please submit your questions, and during the talks, I will look to ask as many as I can in the time frame. We'll start our session with Dr. Povall, whose presentation is titled Imaginary Knowledges and Factual Fights of Fancy, the Power of Art and Creativity in the Climate Debate. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Polly. Yeah, a bit of a mouthful, that title, but good afternoon. I'm, as Polly said, Richard Povall. I'm the director of art.earth. And whenever I'm asked to come up with a title for a talk like this, I always kind of reach into my academic back pocket, but really today's talk should have had a very straightforward title. Art can change the world. So to understand what I mean by that and how it can come about, we need to understand the place that art and beauty have in our lives. So I'd like to make the proposition that there have been two singular visual moments in the past 50 years that have had the greatest impact on the climate change debate. In 1968, Apollo 8 changed all of our lives in a flash when we witnessed Earthrise. This was the first time we'd seen ourselves from the outside, and to see ourselves as insignificant, fragile, and on a planet of extraordinary beauty. This inevitably brought about profound change. And here's my second iconic moment, one that has also brought about change at a societal level.
The oceans, seemingly limitless, invoke in us a sense of awe and wonder, and also sometimes fear. They cover 70% of the surface of our planet, and yet they are still the least explored. Hidden beneath the waves, right beneath my feet, there are creatures beyond our imagination.
But knowing is not enough. Reach, emotive power, beauty, and engagement are all essential ingredients for change. These kind of key moments can only happen once in a generation, so there have to be other ways to keep momentum in between. So, how do we reach people? And more importantly, how do we move them? Let's take a quick cultural tour of our human world. Art, the making of images and sound, has always played a significant role in telling stories and marking relationships. We can learn more about a civilization from its art and poetry and its relationship with the natural world than through any other form of record. So here's a random sampling starting in Chauvet 30,000 years ago and visiting some of the many fleeting civilizations that have come and gone since, outlived in many cases only by the art and thought they left behind. Most notable here is the relationship with the other than human, reflecting an intimate and powerful relationship with the animal kingdom, real and imaginary. The imagined animal sits comfortably alongside the real, spirit and physical worlds perfectly in harmony. These are creatures and landscapes that absolutely could be real. This is the knowledge of the imagination. So what does all this tell us? Above all, these images do not merely reflect the natural world, they amplify it and extend it. Beauty is important. We are but a small part of a giant functioning ecosystem. The US seminal writer, thinker, farmer, and activist Wendell Berry said this: "We know more than we can say." And this is often what the view from science lacks. Scientific method expects absolute objectivity, and thus the language of science, perforce, tends to be dry, disengaged, and perhaps forbidding and alienating. Beauty and emotion have no role in scientific language, despite the fact that many scientists are moved by their discoveries. We can argue then that scientific language is an abrogation of the scientist. So perhaps it's no wonder that this language fails to move people or spur them to action. So this is how art can change the world, by being unafraid to voice the ineffable and the unutterable. We know from endless studies and from anecdotal evidence that science for decades has failed to change behavior. And changing behavior, of course, is the only way we can get close to net zero. Here's the Norwegian psychologist Per Espen Stoknes. The trouble with mainstream conventional climate communication, he says, is that it rubs up against the psychology of our brain. This has been probably the largest scientific communication failure in history. So we need another language, another more human approach. Art can and must change the world. Of the Earthrise image, William Anders on Apollo 8 said this: "We came all this way to explore the moon, and the most important thing we discovered is the Earth." But if such step change can only happen once in a generation, what about changing behavior in more subtle ways? What we need is some real art that speaks to real people, and the way we do that is to engage audiences directly in the work. Importantly, not just the converted, but as many people as possible. So I want to explore with you socially engaged art practice, which is essentially about re-engaging art with the world it inhabits. This is a term that's been around for a few decades and embraces an array of art practice, but what does it actually mean? Well, it means many things, but above all, this art shares some form of genuine engagement with people and place. So I'd like to share 3 socially engaged art projects, chosen not just because I admire the work, but because I know the people involved and therefore I can speak to its motivation. Crucially, this is work not about the artist, but art about the world. Amy Sharrock's Museum of Water is a collection of publicly donated water that tells stories of the people and places it comes from. The collection now holds ghost water and bad dream water, water from the last ice age, a melted snowman, as well as Norwegian spit, 3 types of urine, and 2 different breaths. It holds water from Lourdes, Mecca and the Ganges, the Mediterranean Sea beside a refugee camp on Lesbos, and water from an Aboriginal grandmother remembering the stolen generation and the disappearing wetlands of northern Australia.
Of Water is a live artwork. You know, it depends on other people to make it. It would be nothing without other people.
Anne-Marie Culhane is an Exeter-based social artist whose work tends to appear under the banner of the project rather than under her own name. Flow was a project centered on creating and caring for a new fruit and foraging route for insects, animals and humans along the River Exe, which runs right through the city of Exeter. And above all, it was framed in the form of an invitation. Here's part of that invitation. If you live near the Valley Park, you might like to visit one or more of the trees as part of your exercise at any time during the month of January. Leave a biodegradable gift, hang a piece of toast with plaited twine, or respond creatively through song or words. If you want to send us a snapshot or short video of you with your tree or the orchard, we'll share these via the blog. The language here is important. This is an open invitation to an open process, which is not something you can usually say about the creation of an artwork. Such a process encourages a broad array of voices and knowledges, with none privileged above the other. So my final project is High Water, made collaboratively with all the participants and produced and guided by ourselves here at art.earth and Anne-Marie and Joe Salter at Tidelines. It was brilliantly assisted by our wonderful graduate student Eliska Novakova and had support from Low Carbon Devon. This was a COVID event, a 13.5-hour celebration of and vigil for the equinoctial high tide on March 30th of this year, all taking place on Zoom, with 79 participants from 12 countries, aged from their 20s to their 90s. For me, it proved that intimacy and shared experience can happen in virtual space, despite all of its inherent alienation. Oh, and I learned quite a lot too. We invited people to share with us their story about the sea, and in particular, high tide, wherever they may be. You might be an expert, we said, or you might just visit the sea once a year. Whatever your relationship to the sea, we want to hear from you.
And I'm quite obsessed with the M5 bridge, which you can see in the background here. And the landscape underneath it is really quite fascinating. But during a very high tide, there's a footpath between Exeter and Topsham, which gets cut off.
behind me, you can see a little bit of the Ochils. And from the Ochils, there are so many different streams and burns. So this is one of them. And this is one that I saw on the map that seems to flow nowhere. It's very small. It's Carnottin burn. And it's one of those ones that you can just walk past.
But the story of change is, and its effect is often one received with kind of reluctance. Yet we and our coastlines are surrounded by change. It's just that its pace is outside sometimes our perception. And with climate change, these changes look set to be accelerated and become more unpredictable.
And so much of what we've seen has also been a play of sound, and it's just exploring water and the oceans, how incredibly key sound is to that play, the sound of the water, the way the water.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm using hydrophone as well, so I'm getting the underwater sound, so I'm getting that different kind of acoustic quality and frequency, so the infrared and the ultrasounds, as well as the kind of sounds that we hear.
Depending on the direction of the wind in relation to the tides, it can be driven into Conception Bay and usually arrives in March or April. This is called drift ice. The second way that we get ice in Conception Bay is when the winter is cold enough and ice forms in the bay itself. This is called local ice or bay ice.
I've waited on the beach at Porthcurno, which is not my nearest or local beach, but is most favourable when the tide is at its highest or fullest during the evening of a full moon, and watch the water draw back to low, leaving the beach in newly baptised purity.
And then there's the great story of Bray, the Norse prince, who is challenged to anchor his vessel 3 times consecutively when the tides are at their strongest in the Gulf that is to the north of Jura, sound of Scarpa. And that, of course, is the naming story Corryvreckan, which is why that story got its name.
One of the things that really interests me is sort of being in the littoral zone and thinking about how I can make work in those places in collaboration with some of the creatures that I find there. I am working with dinoflagellates, bioluminescent dinoflagellates that you might find in Puerto Rico or several places around the world.
High tide 8:10. Torabi Sands. 60 strokes at 8:15. Thursday, the 7th of January. High tide 12:13. Torabi Sands.
These projects bring joy, not revulsion. What we need artists for is to remind us that the place where we live is extraordinary, breathtaking, and fragile, and that each and every one of us has to care and has to take action. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Richard. We'll swiftly move on. Please, those of you listening, feel free to send us in some questions. We're going to move swiftly on to Dr. David Sargent. David's presentation is titled Near Future Visions, Imagine the Future. Over to you, David.
Is Polly there?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we seem, I think, to have lost Polly. My name's David Sargent. I'm the second speaker. So, Naomi, if I share my screen, would you be okay to start the PowerPoint? Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Is that visible? Richard, could you let me know? Is that visible on full screen? When I put it to full screen? Yes, it was? Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the relationship between art and climate in a way that echoes and builds on Richard's presentation, really. I'm going to be thinking about the relationship between imagination and change, particularly focusing on the way we imagine the future. So a lot of my work in this area has as its starting point a quote by Frederick Jameson, which has become something of a truism, almost a cliche in the area I work in, but I'm never quite sure how far it's permeated beyond the kind of academic fields that I'm used to. But the quote is this. He once wrote, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism." And it's a quote that becomes more perverse and more disturbing the longer you think about it. The fact that we seem to find it easier, as the prevalence of dystopian and apocalyptic stories around us shows, easier to imagine our world ending, being destroyed, than we do to imagine it changing for the better. And it's related, I think, to a withering of our utopian imagination, and this is Jameson's contention, and related to that, the atrophying of all kinds of social and collective practices which are linked to that imagination, the ability to work and act together, to believe that we can change the world. And I think whether you or not you agree with Jameson's prognosis about the end of capitalism, the force of the quote still holds. We find it easier to imagine our world ending than we do to imagine it changing for the better. And so my project of late has been, I've been looking at how contemporary novelists, filmmakers, TV show makers have been imagining the near future. So the near future being the world to come, the decades to come, the world we might have to live in. And I've been trying to find common factors between these different imaginings. And I'd like to share with you a couple of things I've found. They surprised me. So two things that seem to be held in common and about these films, these novels, these TV shows that are set in the near future. They're all concerned in some way with the imagining of a group of people that's wider and broader than the family. They're also all concerned with the world changing in radical ways. So far, so unexpected, you might say. Of course, climate change will demand radical transformation of every aspect of society. It will demand the close cooperation of large bodies of people. What I found surprising was a large number, perhaps the majority of these fictions set in the near future, though they were striving to respond in a positive and progressive way to the prospect of Anthropocene disaster, whether it be refugees or pandemics or sea rise. They often are organized around a retreat to the family, a retreat to the domestic unit, often in a rural or pastoral seclusion. And the motives underlying this might be understandable. When we think about the future, we often think about families, our family, children, our children. But I think we can also see both the importance and the danger of the stories that are prevalent in a culture at any one time. And that one of the most common go-to narratives in our culture as it currently exists, one of the most common narratives about climate change, the world to come, is also a retreat from the very demands that climate change makes of us. A retreat to the family, to your own kind, to a seclusion, to the rural. A retreat from just transitions, a retreat from collectivity, from shared responsibility. If you were being mean about it, you might say it has more in common with the BBC property programme Escape to the Country than anything else, where a couple are guided by a presenter estate agent in locating their dream private property in the countryside somewhere. Conversely, there are plenty of examples that I found of near future fictions, film and novels that are trying to reimagine how people might live together or how they might bring about radical change or both. But here another complication enters in that it's not as simple as, say, simply dialing up a positive fiction of the future. In that these stories, the stories we might tell ourselves about a climate change future that is positive and constructive, we seem to lack a genre for them. We seem to lack a story. And this is partly to do with the particular challenges posed by climate change. So if you think about narrative stories being pretty much usually based on a protagonist, an individual, but of course climate change is a story about the entire planet. How do you tell a story about the planet through a medium which relies on individuals, through conventional chains of cause and effect and so on? This actually isn't as old a problem as one might think. The historical novel, Walter Scott, Balzac, Tolstoy, they were dealing with exactly the same problems: radical societal change in the wake of European revolutions in the late 18th century. So part of the solution at this level of the novel, of the film, might be to return to old forms such as the historical novel or the utopian novel. And I think it's salutary here to remind ourselves that fictions really can change the world. While we might not be able to order them in as and when we like, we might not be able to predict how any individual story will work and what influence it might have. There are plenty of examples of fictions from one person's head completely changing the course of a culture and the course of history. So to take a couple, one from the late 19th century, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards, 1888, in which a man falls asleep, he falls into a coma effectively, and wakes up in the year 2000 to a socialist United States. The novel was wildly popular when it was first published, so it's pretty much generally forgotten now, I think. Hard to overestimate or overstate how popular it was. Massive bestseller. And it was a detectable, discernible influence on FDR's New Deal in the 1930s. And there's a mural from the programme of works from FDR's New Deal at the bottom of the slide there. Also, Clement Attlee, who of course led Britain into the construction of the welfare state after the Second World War, once named himself a child of the Bellamy ideal. Another example closer to home is the utopian science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, who's been working away for decades writing novels, but he's obviously and explicitly an influence on the formulation of the Green New Deal in American politics, which has recently reached something of a tipping point, it seems, and started to take hold at a national level in the United States. Robinson's full of provocative ideas, like the idea that, as on the left-hand column in the quotes, you might have a national revolution, but the revolution being nothing more, nothing less than simply winning democratic elections. And as Robinson once put it in an interview, the challenge for the novelist in this conception is to imagine a history that gets us from the here to there. It will be hard, impossible, but in trying, the problem is pointed to. He brings out there something of the paradox which Frederick Jameson also speaks of, in that we don't expect utopian fictions, and they will not be predictions, they will not be prophecies, they won't even be plans, but the simple act of imagining, of giving them imaginative bodies, opens up pathways which can then be walked in actuality in the world in different ways. So there's a kind of unguessable, untraceable, and unpredictable, but undeniable link here between the imagination of a better future and the ability for that better future to come into being. So for the kind of final part of my talk, I'm going to talk about ways in which I've tried to kind of bring this sense of stories and imaginations in the culture at large, at the level of the novel, of the feature film, into kind of working with other people, communities, and acts that are more of the kind of art that Richard was talking about, I think, acts of co-production, of imagining in your daily life. So a couple of years ago, I did a project with Region and with various energy communities around South Devon, which we called Feasts for the Future. And the idea was to take this idea of imagining together your society, where you live, but better in the future, and to concretize that and make that into an event and a practice. We came up with the idea of a meal. And how do you make a meal utopian? Utopian here basically being a crude synonym for better than now, as good as possible. So we thought about and served and made ethical foods. We thought about where the food came from. We thought about the energy that was used to cook the food. We selected where the meals would take place quite carefully. And then at the meals, we spoke about the kind of futures we'd like to see. We co-created and co-imagined the places we were sitting in, but at a time in the future when they might have existed in a more utopian fashion, and what that meant for each of us. We also put together these meals in collaboration with a local artist, Barnaby Stone, who made a special feast table. And the table itself became a way of imagining and creating together. You can see various pictures of it on the slide. Barnaby created a tabletop in which he drilled holes, and every diner put in a peg in a constellation of their own making. And Barnaby later planed down those poles and etched in the constellations to make a kind of sky map of our meals, a way of remembering where we'd been and what we each had done. And that table now hangs actually as an artwork on the Plymouth campus. I've also been working with Devon Climate Emergency and the Devon Carbon Plan to move Devon to net zero by 2050 at the latest. You can see there a section from the interim Devon Carbon Plan, which talks about a need for local visions of the future, the need for us to collectively imagine a Devon that is carbon neutral in 2050, for all the reasons I've just mentioned, really. In order to make it seem more real, in order to make it seem possible, and in order to bring together all the different elements of the plan, which otherwise tend to sit often in silos of expertise, planning, food, silos of implementation, north, south, east, west, coastal, rural, urban, different classes, different ages, different experiences. But a fiction can't exist like that. With a fiction, you have to make a world. And so the importance of imagining a net zero Devon to the achievement of a net zero Devon, and working with various people, including Emma Whitaker at Low Carbon Devon, who is also speaking and presenting through the course of this forum. We've put in an application for funding to work with various artists, illustration, animation, web-based games, murals, augmented reality, a poet, and with various communities and with experts on climate zero carbon transition. And the idea will be that we'll co-produce together, co-create together very professionally high-grade examples, visions in these different media of those communities as carbon neutral in 2050. So hopefully that will be a project we will get to do. And you can see on the slide some illustrations from the work of those creative people. I've also just come this morning actually from directing the voice artist in a prose poem which I've been making with Kayla Parker and Stuart Moore of Sundog Media. And we're going to be making a very short film poem in which the film itself will come alive through illustration, etching, animation, with visions of a future that, as to give you a sneak preview of the prose poem underlying it, that's on the other side of now. And so I think you can see here the different ways that creativity, even in my own practice, my own life, this idea of imagining the future takes hold and works out at a kind of academic level where I'm reading novels, poems. In a way, I'm working and living with other people in my community, in communities around Devon and where I live, and also in creative practice. I am also a poet and a fiction writer. My latest collection was called The Pronoun Utopia, where I was trying to kind of find forms, like how do you write poetic forms that can bring together different voices and different experiences. And just to flag up really that this is, as Richard brought out, I think, this imagining these acts of creativity are a collective concern. And I think we each need to be creative in our lives, in our daily lives, in what we do, in order to bring forth this kind of world we want to see happen. And I've got plenty of colleagues at Plymouth who are doing similar projects. My colleague Mandy Bloomfield's working on oceans and poetry and culture, and she recently made a film with an artist about plastic in the ocean. My colleague Ben Smith has written a very good novel called Doggerland, set in a flooded landscape of the future. And my colleague Miriam Darlington is a very great nature writer, written about owls, otters. So there's lots of this kind of work going on at Plymouth. I think partly it is about joining up those different beads of mercury into a pool of silvery fluid substance that can show us a better future.
Great,
thank you very much.
David. Thanks, David. That's fantastic. Fantastic. Shall I bring Richard back to the screen? Is that possible? Yes. Can I see your? Oh yes, no, David, stay with us. Stay with us. Don't run off. Great,
Richard.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. We seem to have lost Polly.
No, I can see Polly. So
I'm here.
You can see Polly.
Yeah.
I can't see Polly. Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me, David?
Apparently not.
No, apparently not. Okay, so maybe you can be the mingling one, Richard. If I say something, then you can pass it on to David, who can hear us. You're in the middle of my screen, so then maybe you can do it. But anyway, I'm not sure. Maybe the tech team can have a look and see why David can't hear me. Maybe you can have a look at that. We need to sort of think about, so we've got quite a lot of questions coming. So first of all, thank you both very much for your contributions to the session. Really, really interesting. The sort of, you've got me already. I'm already a winner of the arts, already there of imagination. I'm there for the beauty, etc. What's been quite interesting coming through is the questions about how we might action this. So both David and Richard talked about beauty. We talked about the future of beauty and actually how we might imagine that. But it's around about one of those kind of aspects of how we might action. None of us like to be told off. So one of the things I would say to you is there a way, maybe I'll say it with Richard, because I think, Richard, you can hear me. What are the actions that we can play? Sort of somebody mentioned this gentle nudging. Liz Wells was talking about the gentle nudging. Johnny was talking about the fact that the fear and the shock that's brought forward, and how actually we think about beauty in a sort of nudging way, that we will all act and do something. Yeah,
David, I think can you hear me? But you can't hear Polly. Okay, so there is a question about what do we need to do? How can we do to kind of use the ideas of nudge and gentle and beautifulness. And I think for me, the answer is quite simple, that we have to engage people, and we have to do it at the local level, and we have to do it with gently and slowly and in quite small ways. And these things have to happen incrementally. That nothing's, these are very different from these kind of like big iconic moments I was talking about, that we just, as artists, we just have to keep working on the ground, working with people, and again, letting them find their own route to how they engage. And, the challenge is always, well, how do you do that with people who aren't already doing it?
Without sort of speaking to the converted as well.
Exactly. So how do you, and for me, these kinds of projects that really engage with people on the ground and work with families, and in fact, often it's the kids who will bring the parents in. These are ways, going into public domains, going into forests, going into shopping malls. These are the ways that you reach out to those who are not already speaking this language.
Yeah, fantastic. Richard, can you ask David to answer that question?
David, do you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, thanks, Richard, for acting as an intermediary in my deaf and dumb state. I completely agree, and I just think, we valorize, we put on a pedestal works of art, works of creation that make it big time, but it should be something that's a part of people's lives and a part of communities as well. And I think when we talk about refreshing, regenerating senses of communities, it's exactly at the same time it's about refreshing, regenerating senses and actually existent communities from these kind of far more atomized and distributed lives we tend to be living. So I think those two things go together.
I mean, the biggest challenge, of course, is always how do you pay for it? Because this is not very often this is not the kind of art that that brings in funding. It's there's work that's really hard to do on the ground, and I think that's a question for others. That's a question for funders. It's a question for sustainable Earth, if you like. It's a challenge because it's, as you say, it's not the kind of work that's valorized. It's work that is hard and very difficult to fund.
Yeah, but I think one of the best things about art is that it needn't always cost money or produce money. And I mean, what better kind of occupation in the world we live in a deeply satisfying activity that you don't have to buy anything, you don't have to sell anything, and it doesn't use anything other than your own human spirit and those of others. So one of the best things is that we can extract it from the kind of chain of commodification and buy and sell.
I think that we're coming. There's lots of questions coming through in the chat here. The big one, which you've already picked up on, Richard, about the cost of things, which of course one of the things that we're looking into in HE and how we're working in HE, and the cuts that education's coming. I think my question to you would be, my last question to be is, if you had to do one thing, what would it be?
Keep working on the ground. Just keep connecting to people. Just keep reminding people that actually this place is precious. And I'd also try not to swear on screen. But,
Finally,
sorry.
Thank you so much. We're going to finish now. I mean, we've only really got started the conversation. What would be fantastic is, before we give you, so thank you both, is to everybody who is joining this chat, if you could sort of please feel free to join the discussion group around the creativity and the cultures. We want more of this happening. We want more people to engage, and this is just the start of it. So it gives me great pleasure to thank you both, even if David can't hear me, to thank you, Richard, and thank you, David, as well, for your really inspiring talks and really making us kind of really think about what we could do next. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.